Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here. And I just want to say at the outset that I no longer live in Sri Lanka. I'm calling from New York. And I hope my colleagues at home will forgive me for taking this spot to speak about the state of human rights in Sri Lanka. And while I remain close, obviously, to current events in Sri Lanka, on the ground knowledge is, of course, cannot be replaced. But I wanted to just speak about three things that I think will resonate with others in the region. First, I'd like to just briefly discuss the Prevention of Terrorism Act, or the PTA of 1979, and its impact, ongoing impact on human rights in Sri Lanka. Hundreds of people have been arbitrarily detained in Sri Lanka using this law, and it has frequently been used to target those belonging to minorities or dissidents. The law allows for arrest without warrant and permits detention for up to 18 months without the detainee ever being produced in a court. And some PTA prisoners have been incarcerated for years, some over a decade. And we know that PTA prisoners are frequently subjected to torture and that many are forced to sign false confessions. Human rights activists and organizations, both local and international, have repeatedly documented human rights abuses under this law and noted that it is used for politically motivated arrests of activists who are critical of the government. Human rights mechanisms and international bodies have often called for the full repeal of the PTA time and time again, and social movements have frequently prioritized this demand for decades. But the current Rajapaksa regime is not just embracing it, but further strengthening it. A new so-called anti-terror regulation issued in March of this year targets de-radicalization from holding violent extremist religious ideology and significantly expands the abusive PTA. The regulation, simply put, will allow the government of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to more efficiently and unapologetically target religious and racial minorities, ethnic minorities in Sri Lanka. And this brings me to the second thing that I wanted to talk about, which is about the broad-based anti-Muslim violence and discrimination which is happening in Sri Lanka. The latest regulation is one of many such attempts to build a powerful continuum of action against Muslim communities' human rights. In March this year, the Sri Lankan government also announced plans to ban the burqa and closure of more than 1,000 madrasas, citing national security. Throughout the worst of the COVID pandemic, the government prohibited Muslim families from burying their COVID dead, citing public health, though it had no medical basis. And Muslim lawyers and human rights defenders have come under great scrutiny under the current government, making an already fragile human rights situation even more so. And many are being held under the law that I just spoke about, the PTA. While in times before 2015, the Rajapaksa regime was known for use of extrajudicial abductions, detentions, and killings to send its message, the current government of the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa uses legal mechanisms to do so. An important distinction. One of the ways that they do this is setting up task forces and committees appointed by the president. One such committee is the insidious One Country, One Law task force, headed by a Buddhist monk who's most famous for inciting deadly anti-Muslim violence in 2014 and 2018. While feminists have long argued for decades that customary laws, such as the Muslim personal laws in Sri Lanka, are discriminatory to women and need to be reformed, we fear that this task force makes the total erasure of cultural difference its mission, legitimizing Sinhala Buddhist dominance in all aspects of public life for Sri Lankans. Finally, I think it would be remiss of me if I didn't talk about the state of LGBTIQ human rights in Sri Lanka, an issue that I work on very closely. LGBTIQ movements have been campaigning for decades for decriminalization, as same-sex sex remains in the criminal penal code and is heavily stigmatized. So successive governments have failed to deliver on this, despite the fact that we know it would be essential to the health of overall democracy and human rights in Sri Lanka. LGBTIQ persons are less likely to use existing legal mechanisms to access pathways for justice, even when they are victims of violence or human rights abuses, because they fear the law and its instruments. Most recently, a video went viral of a Sri Lanka police training where the trainer was seen training police officers in harmful queerphobic stereotypes and myths. Given the already fraught relationship between law enforcement and the LGBTI community, to many of us, this was a clear reminder of how the LGBTIQ person's image is constructed for those in law enforcement. But a leading LGBT human rights organization and others in civil society filed a petition against the Sri Lanka police and the trainer. And on December 8th, the Court of Appeal granted a leave to proceed with the petition, which many are considering a victory. This shows that the court system can work in favor of human rights, but it is a stark reminder for those of us in movements of the nature and complexity of small wins in times of big losses. I bring this question up because it is one I know that many of you across the region are asking yourselves. How do we navigate the complex push and pull of living in times of ethnocentrism and the erosion of our democratic institutions and spaces, while targeting the mechanisms which do remain to us? How do we celebrate these wins when we know our human rights institutions and the independent mechanisms we relied on are being infiltrated and compromised all the time? So unfortunately, I am maybe a little less optimistic than I think Lara before me, but I really admire and applaud that optimism and courage, and I'll take it with me. And I can only leave us with just questions. Thank you very much.